Welcome to the Your Data Driven podcast. If you like this podcast, be sure to visit our website at yourdatadriven.com for more useful help and advice on setting up your race car, mastering data analysis, and driving faster. Welcome to episode 17. So welcome to part 2 of this conversation with Formula 1 engineer Dave Devine. In part 1, we talked about his early career and how he managed to become an engineer in Formula 1. If that's something you're interested in, then make sure you have a listen to part 1 before listening to this one. In part 2, we get much more into the depth of working with Formula 1 drivers, how to elicit great feedback, and also how he can pull knowledge from his working environment back into his own racing. I hope you find the second part as fascinating as the first, so sit back and I hope you enjoy the show. So you've rapidly moved to the front of the car now. There's only the driver to worry about.
Yes, and to be honest with you, my desire, I had a desire to get onto suspension right from an early age because of the racing I did with my father. We spent so much time developing the suspension that I knew that it could give performance to a car, and so all of a sudden, that's always an area that I was keen to work on. And as soon as the opportunity came up at Force India, I said to the head of mechanical, I said, please let me have a go. I'm super passionate, super keen. And unfortunately, yes, he said yes and took me on. And as you say, it's a great area of the car because you've got the driver involved all of a sudden. So he's got a steering wheel, which moves the suspension. He's got a brake pedal, which obviously has an effect. But then also, again, because it's Formula 1, everything's got an aerodynamic effect as well. So you're always aware of the aerodynamic influence of the suspension. And so we have a lot of people that all have got to say in what the front suspension needs to do, how it needs to operate, what it needs to look like. And so it's a great fun trying to juggle all of these ideas and requests and then try and come up with the solution with least compromises, really.
So your role, just for the benefit of people listening, is to try and pull all of that together by the sound of it. So you've got different specialists that people may or may not be aware of, so it might be worth telling people about that. And then trying to manage each one of their objectives such that you get effectively the best compromise.
Exactly, yes. So we have, and I think it's similar for most Formula 1 teams, we have a vehicle performance group who do simulations. They run a simulator and they are constantly looking at ride performance and how to change damping springs, everything else for best ride performance. We have an aerodynamic...
So a bit like your curbing experience, only with a bit more manpower.
Exactly, much more manpower, definitely. And yes, exactly, curbing performance is one. And they also look at, because the problem with Formula 1 is that it's so aero-dominated that, again, we've got a very large aero team. Well, I say very large aero team. Compared to other teams, probably not very large. But to me, it feels like...
Compared to the people listening,
exactly.
It's a very large area.
It's a lot of people are involved. And of course, they look at the suspension and especially the wishbone members, they look at those normally as an inconvenience and they don't want them there. And so they're always trying to shrink them or lose them. They do occasionally use them as turning vanes as well, sorts of things. So you've got the request coming in from them. We've got a whole structures team as well. So they are using FEA, finite element analysis, and they're looking at the structural capability of components and things like that. So you can imagine that they certainly don't want things to break. So the last thing they want to do is to make any components smaller. And then we've got the driver, who the feedback from the driver is important. Come up with ideas in the past where I've been convinced it'd be worth lap time, but the driver just cannot get on with it in the simulator. So in the end, it's not worth the lap time, because if he's not happy with the car, then he's not going to push to 100%.
Now, it's fascinating that can happen even at a professional level. We talked about this before. Obviously, we can't talk about the specifics, but the concept that you've got this huge engineering team who've done a lot of effort to find lap time, and the concept that you've come up with is novel, but the driver still gets a kind of veto on whether or not they can make it work. The driver does have to feel confident in the car at times, but you just think as a professional sports person, perhaps that they would almost be told to get on with it.
That was my initial idea, that why can't they just be told that this is quicker, you need to get on with it. But I think it's quite pleasing and refreshing to hear. I know certainly a lot of people, when watching Formula One, just think that the person with the fastest car will win and the person with the slowest car will come last. But it goes to show that the driver does still have influence, and the driver, can't just drive anything, and so the car needs to be usable, and if the car isn't usable, then the driver won't get the lap time. So I think from that point of view, it was quite refreshing to see all of a sudden that no, just because the computer says it is faster doesn't mean actually when your driver gets onto the track it will be faster. And I know certainly from my racing, we sort of barely go over 100 miles an hour, and yet you feel like you're zooming along, and you stop back and you step back and think, hang on a minute, they're zipping around Monaco 10 seconds faster than I think now than Senna did. There's a lot going on, and it's all happening very quickly. So if you just prevent the driver from making that split second decision, or make him just pause and think for a second, then the speeds that everything's going on at that lap time is a notable lap time. So unless, I guess, if I came up with a solution that was a second a lap faster, we could lose a couple of tenths from the driver maybe. But generally the sort of lap time we're looking for is less than a tenth usually. And so a driver not happy, then all of a sudden it's not gonna go onto the car.
So I've got a question for you, which we'd be working up to. But what kind of things have you been able to take from the day job that you apply to your racing? Because these days you are back out racing yourself, and you're in the historics racing in those championships, which are hugely popular and again at very high level with a lot of professional drivers and such like. So is there anything you've been able to take from the day job or the day jobs and go the other way around? Because we've talked about what you're able to bring to them, but equally flipping it the other way, having exposure to a professional racing team or teams, what have you been able to take from the day job and bring it to your own racing?
I think one of the biggest things is almost procedures and things like that, bizarrely, and setup sheets and things like this. It's just interesting to look at how they document things and plan things and record things and things like that is always been useful, because I'm terrible we'll do development on the car and test things, and all of a sudden 6 months down the line you go, oh, hang on, when we put this, was it with that or was it with that? So even simple things like just the procedure of running a car has been very interesting.
What do you mean by that, the procedure of running a car?
Just so to set out a run plan of what you want to test, to try and come up with an idea of an order that would be a sensible order to test it, various items in, and how to record that. I think if you arrive at a test with no paper, no pen, and you just try a few things, I think it's very easy to then down the line to forget that or confuse. It's quite easy to then go, oh, the car's working well this weekend and I got a good result, so I'm not going to change it next weekend, when all of a sudden you're a bit further off the pace. Whereas I think obviously if you can keep a record of everything you try and the effects that it did, any comments of how it felt and obviously performance, then I think it just opens up a bit more in the future when you decide, when you get to a track and you go out for qualifying or practice and you're a bit like, well, the car's a little bit oversteery, a little bit understeery. You're not as scared to then go and adjust the car and make modifications. And hopefully, again, if you've got a record of everything you've done, you can look back and say, hang on a minute, when we went testing here and we tried this, that happened, or that changed tyre temperatures or pressures. And so I think it just gives you a more structured approach to motor racing, really.
There's two bits you've talked about there which are quite interesting. There's the keeping records of what you've achieved when you're doing a test or on a test day, and what you've changed and how that feels and whether it was fast or slow. But the other bit that you touched on there, which I don't see personally that often, but I think could be almost more powerful is planning what you're actually going to do, because often you arrive at a test session and there's so much going on by that point. It takes everything just to get the car out on track on time. By which point it's a case of let's just go and do some laps and we'll work it out. And then you get into the day and you're away. And having a structured plan already beforehand is something that I think the Formula One guys take for granted that they do. Is every minute of the car is accounted for when it's on track. And maybe that's something that's quite easy to translate back into a club racing environment. It's like we're going testing. We've got 3-4 sessions in the test. They're 20 minutes. What exactly are we going to do or try and achieve in each one?
Yes, certainly. And people may forget as well that at Formula One team, we're limited on what tyres we can use. We're limited on engine mileage, even testing mileage. And they've got to be useful kilometres on the track all the time. You've got to be learning in a test all the time. There's no point going out and driving round and round. And I think people obviously believe that Formula One teams have got endless money and things like this. But actually, we have limitations as well. We have limitations, like I say, on tyres and on engine mileage. So I think it's almost, you just need to make sure that every minute you are out on track, that you are trying to learn something about the car or about yourself, even your driving technique, and hopefully take that away with you. We see a lot of cases of people will go on a test and they'll roll the car off and they'll drive around and put the car back on and go home again. And I've certainly been one for, if I've stopped learning, but if there's no more to learn, then I'll pack up the car and go, because it's just a case of it's wearing the car out. We're not learning anything, so let's stop. And I think, as you say, there's usually, for the average club racer, there's usually so much going on that it's just too easy to end up after the test thinking, I wish we would have tried this. I wish we would have tried that. So I think going with some structure of what you want to achieve and try and obviously be realistic about it as well. I think it's easy to over plan. We even do that at Formula One. We quite often don't hit all of our targets during the day.
So is that something you've actually done, though? Is that something you've done as a result of being exposed to these kind of guys who are doing it professionally? Is that something you've actually brought into your own racing?
Yes, we do, definitely. Certainly, before I go to any test, for me, the luxury of testing isn't quite as, we don't test quite as much as I would like anymore. But certainly, when I go, yes, I will always have a plan of what I want to achieve. It does help. It just forces you to concentrate on the task and what you want to achieve. And again, even if you find that whatever you try, just anything, if it makes the car slower, then it's been of benefit. You haven't lost anything. You can go back to where you were. And so this is what we've always had the mantra of. So don't be afraid of trying things. And because again, if you find out 10 things that make the car slower, well, that's good, because you know not to do that in the future. So yes, I would rate planning very highly for test days, certainly. Yeah.
So you got some planning. Anything else that you've been able to bring from the day job, maybe in terms of the engineering side or some of your understanding, or even the drivers? Do you get some exposure to what they're doing and think, actually, that is the difference between a club level driver and a professional driver?
As for the actual driving side of things, again, this is where my racing at club level and having some relative success, I can then see, and I've been very fortunate and very glad that I raced up to the level I did, because I can see when a driver like Perez, for example, if you watch him during the qualifying runs, because they do multiple runs throughout the qualifying session, he almost every time will set his fastest lap in the last qualifying run of the session. He's extremely good at just gradually creeping up and just adding, just taking off sort of at a tenth and just creeping up on the performance. And again, when you watch their on boards, the commitment, just lap after lap of commitment, of using every last millimeter of track, the level of skill involved, I think it just goes to show that when you honestly look back at your own racing, you then start to look at, I probably did leave a foot of track there, and probably it was not quite right there, and things like that. And yet you look at these guys and the level of commitment and skill involved, and the speed that they're doing it at as well. You think the racing you do feels like you're going very fast, but these guys are obviously going almost twice as fast as what we're doing. And I was also lucky enough to see Esteban Ocon in the simulator.
Is it the same as my PlayStation, or is there a little bit more going on? It's obviously a leading question. I know the answer, but just to give people, what could you share in terms of the simulator that people might be interested to know about?
Simulators are quite a significant thing for a Formula One team these days, and they are used quite heavily. Our simulator, I think, would need a minimum of about 4 engineers to run. It is a very sophisticated bit of kit now, and it takes up a large room and has a separate room with a whole suite of desks and screens and things like this for people to be. It's effectively being at a race meeting. What the information they're getting, it's like the screens and the layout is almost like they have at the circuit. And watching someone like Ocon whilst in a simulator, it was phenomenal how quickly he can switch on and off. He would basically start a run. I think I was watching at Hungary or somewhere like that. Would start half a lap before the start line, and it would come around the last few corners. And again, the commitment would be, as if he'd just driven the past 20, 30 laps effectively, no faults or anything. And then it'd do 2 laps, like one time lap, and stop. They don't come over across on the intercom. Thank you, Ocon. Yeah, we'll just look at that data now. And he then gets out his phone and he's sitting on his mobile phone, just sitting in the simulator. And then all of a sudden they come back. Okay, we're ready to go again, and we're just going to try this. And he's okay, puts his phone down, and again starts as if nothing has changed. And the professionalism of it and the ability just to switch on and off is very impressive. There's no warm up time or anything like that. It was a case of he knows he needs half a lap effectively and he can be setting a hot lap, and the ability of that was phenomenal. And
do you think if he did 3 or 4 laps, he would be quicker, or do you think he's just on the pace within half a lap?
Yes, basically, I think he's just on the pace, and not only being on the pace, because obviously this is testing now. It's the feedback you get from that.
Feedback is something that again comes up very regularly, and the question is, particularly at a club level, in terms of if you're on your own, making your own notes, but also if you're working with someone in terms of feedback, how do you either give or elicit great driver feedback?
I think, again, my only relatively limited experience of it, I think the great drivers for feedback, there's no emotion, no kind of ideas or suggestions as such. It's almost just to give direct feedback of what is happening with the car. I think once a driver starts to express, oh, this is happening, that is happening, as in referencing certain components and things like that, I think that's where you need them to step back and say, no, just purely at corner entry, mid-corner, corner exit, what is happening in each of those 3 phases. And they'll generally look at high-speed corners, low-speed corners, so they'll pick out 1 or 2, 3 corners of the circuit. And then the idea is you give feedback on all of those phases. And I can imagine at times you almost, as an engineer, you want to make the changes blind to the driver, so they literally have no idea. But I think that's sometimes a bit unsettling and unnerving for the driver. I think they like to be involved. So quite often they do give them. And then the changes will always be A changes. So you always need to go back again to make sure that the driver isn't just improving in himself, and that the changes you are seeing are genuine. There's a lot of repetition for the drivers in the simulator, because again, just every change we make, you start off with a baseline, make the change, then have to go back to the baseline for every single change you can think of.
Oh, okay, so it's not sort of ABCA, it's ABA.
More often than not, yes, because you just need to ideally isolate every development if possible. And they, again, full credit to the drivers, because if you speak to someone and you say, oh, they're a simulator driver, you think, oh, well, I love playing on my PlayStation. But again, to maintain the level of concentration and professionalism and deliver good feedback for the time that they're sitting in it it's a tough ask mentally. And certainly from what I saw of Ocon, he was very good at it.
So what did he say? So you're saying, tell us about high speed and low speed corners, and you've got corner entry, mid corner, and exit. But what is he actually saying about that?
Often the only sort of feedback, as I say, is almost corner entry, instability, basically, mid corner, instability, and then corner exit, generally sort of traction effectively. So he just is breaking down those sections going into the corner. Have we got a stable car or not? Mid corner, again, it's generally stability and feel on the steering as well. And then corner exit, picking up the throttle. And so it's literally just that.
When you say feel on the steering,
quite often we can make the driver feel that the car is doing something that it isn't. So quite often it's good to hear the driver give steering weights and things like this, and just what his feedback he's getting through the steering wheel. And the other thing for simulation, of course, is tyre modelling is a very tricky business for simulations. Again, it's good for a team to have feedback from the driver of what they're getting through the steering wheel. And then quite often for a test driver, that's why you want a test driver to then go into the real car to give the same feedback from there, because you can then, if what they're feeling on the circuit doesn't correlate to what they're feeling in the simulator, then it goes to show that something's not quite right. And so that's why it's often good just to the physical feedback from the steering wheel. Is it light? Is it heavy? Things like this. It's useful to then compare that to the circuit, because if you're not getting the same from the circuit, it might make you question the tyre model during slow speed or during high speed and things like this. So actual, not only car handling, but almost how does it feel? How does the steering wheel feel to you is also useful.
Right, it just sounds fascinating. I think that there's two things on the feedback, both fascinating at one level, but also it's quite simple, really. You have this idea that maybe because it's a professional environment, you've got 4 or 5 engineers running around, that the level of feedback is going to be more complicated. But I think from what you're saying, it's just give me a simple understanding of how you're feeling as you're driving around, and then we'll work out the next part of the puzzle, which is that what we expected? Do we need to do anything about it, etc.?
It's certainly that's where you start from, and then with the data, hopefully what the driver is giving feedback that matches the data, and then from there you would then investigate more in certain areas, and you could then start asking more questions. But from the start, you certainly want the driver to try and keep it as basic as possible.
In terms of bringing that back into your own racing, that's quite encouraging, really, because one of the things about the processes, just even the word processes makes you feel exhausted, because it's just, well, for me anyway, it's just, it doesn't get me excited. It's not the most exciting thing about motor racing. It's like, the process that I use and the way I record. That's not why you're doing it, but it's the discipline and the means to an end. And I suppose from what you're saying, if you can make it as simple and yet still valuable, then perhaps people are more likely to adopt that and then just start learning and start improving.
Yeah, certainly. I know on the cars I race at the moment, the amount of adjustment isn't there to be able to change the characteristics in the 3 phases of the corners. There's limited things you can change, whereas obviously on a Formula 1 car there's still quite a lot we can change. But I think certainly if you can just break down the 3 areas of the corner.
Is there any area of the corner that you'd prioritise?
Personally, or at work?
Well, I don't know. Is it different?
It depends, I would say, at work. I think ultimately, again, we'd say for a professional driver, it's a case of we do still ask, where do you think you are losing lap time? And if they say corner entry, like I can't turn in because the back end feels like it's going to rotate, then they focus on that. But then you'll always then, because you've broken the corner down into 3 phases, that you can then say we can change this for corner entry. But if that then is going to be a negative knock on to mid corner exit, then maybe you won't be quite so keen to do it. So I think that's the other thing by breaking it down as well, is that with the Formula 1 car, that there's multiple solutions to any problem. Again, if you just say corner entry is a problem, we can then look at the other 2 phases and say, actually, the best way to solve that without affecting the other 2 phases is going to be X. Or if the instability continues to mid corner, then we may look at a different solution to do it. So I wouldn't say there's necessarily a particular area to concentrate on, because at the end of the day, it's just where the data is obviously great for trying to find out where you are losing time, because you can then make the change and see directly on the data whether it's had a positive or negative effect. I wouldn't say there's exactly the best place to aim to look at.
What about for your own racing?
For my own racing, especially in the world of historics with rear wheel drive, and period tyres.
Yeah, but you say that. Yeah, I think I know where you're going with this, with what you're about to say. But it's really competitive.
Oh,
so
it's super competitive, and there's basically traction, rear end traction is king, I would say, because getting power down, even with I drive a 1959 Riley with it's only got 135 horsepower or something like this. It's not a lot, but even then it can still spin the wheels, especially if it's damp. So traction certainly is key, and whereas I suppose lower power cars, corner exit is not quite so critical. It is critical, but traction, corner exit is not quite so critical because you're not trying to put as much down. So you could argue mid corner is maybe more of interest, trying to carry the speed through the corner because you're not looking at trying to put down close to 1,000 horsepower in a Formula One car these days. Yeah, so I suppose I guess with a lower power Formula car, with a lower power circuit racer that I race, we're looking maybe more at mid corner to carry the speed through the corner rather than trying to put all this power down when you come out of the corner.
It's interesting to hear you say that because a lot of people at a club level, it seems, are very focused on the corner entry. Of all of the things of all the phases of the corner, the most discussion, I would say, is on the corner entry. And yet, here we are as a Formula One engineer telling us that really we need to be looking at traction, and then if that's not a problem, the mid. But we haven't even talked about the corner entry. And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because that is a bit of a weird situation that all the focus is on the entry, yet the lap time is coming at the other phases of the corner, possibly.
Yeah, certainly. I have quite often found that it's easy to overdrive an entry. It's easy to brake too late. And I find as soon as you brake too late, you've destroyed the corner, basically. I always, if I recommend anything to anyone, is you could sacrifice a tenth on the entry just to guarantee you get that exit every time, the mid and the exit every time. I think that the entry is almost, that for me personally, is the last bit I would look to find time in. As long as you've got no significant problems with braking and that first tipping into the corner, then I would say yes, almost the entry is almost, for me personally, is the last place I would look to find time.
When you're doing your racecraft and you're in a race, it's a slightly different scenario perhaps, but in terms of trying to get up your lap time in qualifying or whatever, or maybe you've broken away at the front, what you're suggesting is to sacrifice a little bit on the entry so that you guarantee getting the mid and exit.
Yeah, certainly, and I've got to admit that's probably been my biggest downfall in my own racing, has been that when I'm by myself over one lap I can be fairly competitive, but when it comes to racing, in my head I've got all the time, I know the best to get the ultimate lap time, I need to be braking here, and I have to quickly take that out of my head and say, look, you need to sacrifice this corner because you need to try and outbrake the person. And so, as you say, when you're racing, things change slightly because to overtake, you generally need to outbrake someone. So corner entry all of a sudden becomes more critical. But again, for circuit racing in general, if you're quick in qualifying, you can start at the front and hopefully you're not having to overtake. And so that's ultimately going to give you your quickest race time. Effectively, is being at the front. So corner entry is still of importance, but if you're quicker in qualifying, you can start at the front and you don't need to worry about overtaking anyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it, buddy. If you've got one final thought for people listening, given your experience both at work and racing, that they can get as a takeaway and think, yeah, that is something I never really thought of before, that would really help their racing, that they may be surprised at, or it might sound a bit counterintuitive. One final thought that we might leave people with to ponder as they carry on with their day.
I think generally from everything I've done personally and racing, my own personal racing, and from work, is that it's not impossible. Basically, I think motorsport can often seem very daunting, but it's not impossible. And at the end of the day, you've got 4 pieces of rubber attaching you to the circuit. So again, if you're clear and methodical and do your research, I think anyone can be reasonably competitive. It's just a case of going through these procedures, as I said, about looking at the different phases of the corners, not overdriving, things like this. And generally, I tell people that my fastest laps are almost the most boring laps because you're not sliding around and things like that. And I think you just need to try and analyse it as best you can. Try and make it a bit less exciting and a bit more of a science experiment, really, is the best way I could suggest for a club racer.
Very good of you to say, because I've written an article using that exact phrase, science experiment. So,
all right. Yeah,
it's almost like I primed you for it. But actually, one thought, because you say that and it sounds brilliant, but one thing what people may not realise is that you have actually put this in practice. So you have actually had a teammate who was towards the middle, towards the back of the grid, and you were able to work with him and bring him towards the front, such that he was very consistently competitive. I thought it would be worth mentioning. Is there anything that you learned doing that? It was meant to be the final thought a minute ago, but as you were saying it, it came into my head. And I thought, no, actually, that's really a really good example that people would love to hear about. Yeah. Just one bit of it, anyway.
Yeah, it's certainly, before I kind of did sort of any coaching or anything like that, it was I warned him that I was going to make motor racing more boring. And he was like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And I said, unfortunately, this sliding around that you're doing isn't quick. And basically, I just used braking boards for him to brake at and various points to turn in at and points on curbs to hit. And all of a sudden, the lap time and consistency came from nowhere. And the other thing as well, which was fascinating, was we had an intercom, and he'd mess up one corner and I could hear his breathing start to change. And he was clearly getting worked up, and I could see he was holding the steering wheel differently. And again, it's this business of, if you break a corner down into sections all the time, then it doesn't matter what's happened at the previous corner. We can forget about that. We've made a mistake, but it doesn't matter. Forget about that. Because when we come to this next corner, we know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to brake at that board. We're going to turn in at that point. We're going to find that point on the curve, and then we're going to let the steering go out to that point on the exit. And if you can start to break the track down like this all the time in each corner, then it almost doesn't matter what's happened. You can just jump in the car and do it. And I guess the professional drivers, this must be something similar to what they're doing all the time to get the consistency that they get, and to be able to find those last little bits of lap time, because they can say, well, I braked at that board and I can just nudge it a little bit further, and actually on the exit I'm going to just aim at the next part of the curve along, that sort of thing. And as I say, unfortunately, it makes it less exciting, which I apologise for. But if you want to be quick, I think it's a sure way to achieve lap time. Now, don't get me wrong, I know there's people out there, Senna always comes to my mind, who just, I'm not sure he did drive like that. I think he could just drive by the seat of his pants and just perform. But I think for the average person, and me including, that I think if you can break circuits down into chunks, then almost anyone can do it, really.
That's a lovely thought to finish on. And I just want to say thank you again for taking the time and for everything you've shared. It's a real privilege to be able to talk to someone working in Formula One and who still races as well and competes very successfully in the old historic. Thank you very much for taking the time, Dave.
No, thank you, Samir. It's great to talk. And again, if it helps anyone out there, then that's good news to me.
Well, what an absolute privilege to have Dave Devine on the show. I hope you found these two parts really interesting and given you lots of food for thought in terms of improving your own racing. The importance of process, the importance of breaking down the corner, the importance of making sure you're consistent, the importance of trying different things and learning every time. He said about making it boring, but I don't think he really meant it quite that way. It was really great to have him on the show. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Until next time. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at yourdatadriven.com.